Sometimes those who laugh loudest are the ones who underestimate you most. Ethan Pennywise knew that feeling all too well. A cowboy so poor he slept under stars, Ethan scraped together every cent to buy the foreclosed stable of Baron Von Gault. Townsfolk mocked him, calling it a mansion for fleas. But while cleaning grime off massive horse troughs, his knife made a shocking discovery. The troughs weren't iron, they were solid gold, painted black to hide the Baron's fortune. Tons of bullion, hidden in plain sight. What would you do if your greatest humiliation became your greatest triumph? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if this story truly touches you or resonates with your own life experiences, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly extra special for you that you won't want to miss. The morning sun broke across the Montana horizon like liquid copper, spilling light over the weathered buildings of Dustridge. It was the kind of small town where everyone knew your business before you did, where reputations were built over decades and torn down in whispered conversations on Sunday church steps. The year was 1891, and change came slowly to places like this, carried on dusty boots and weary shoulders. Ethan Pennywise stood at the edge of town, looking at the massive structure that now belonged to him. At 47 years old, his face told the story of a hard life, honestly lived. Deep lines framed eyes that had seen too many sunrises from the wrong side of comfort, and his hands bore the permanent stains of labor that soap could never quite wash away. His clothes, though clean, had been mended so many times that the original fabric seemed more memory than material. The stable towered before him, a monument to wealth he could scarcely imagine. Baron Von Gault had built it 20 years ago, when he'd first arrived in Dustridge with money that seemed to flow like mountain streams. 40 stalls arranged in 2 facing rows, each one large enough to house the finest horses money could buy. The structure itself rose 3 stories high, with a hayloft that could store feed for a small army of animals. Ornate ironwork decorated the entrance. Though rust had claimed much of its former glory, the wood, once painted a dignified dark green, had faded and peeled under Montana's unforgiving sun and brutal winters. Ethan had known better days. 3 years ago he'd owned a small ranch 15 miles north of town, nothing grand but honest land that had belonged to his father before him. 200 acres of grazing land, a modest herd of cattle, and a small house where he'd planned to grow old with simple dignity. Then came the drought. 2 summers without rain, watching his herd thin, his savings evaporate, his hope dry up like the creek beds. When the bank came calling, he'd signed over the deed with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the weight of failure. Since then, he'd worked whatever jobs he could find, mucking stables for other men, mending fences, breaking horses that younger cowboys found too ornery. He slept wherever he could, sometimes in haylofts when barn owners took pity, more often under the stars with nothing but his saddle for a pillow and his worn blanket for warmth. Every penny he earned, he saved in a small leather pouch that never left his person. $127. It had taken 3 years to save that much, living on hardtack and creek water, going without coffee, without tobacco, without any small comfort that might delay his singular goal. He wanted a roof over his head, just that. A simple thing most men took for granted, but to Ethan it represented something more precious than gold: dignity. The stable had gone into foreclosure when Baron Von Gault died 6 months earlier. The Baron had been an odd man, reclusive and paranoid in his final years. He'd arrived in Dustridge in 1871 with a fortune made in silver mining down in Nevada, or so the story went. Some said he'd been a railroad man. Others whispered darker origins. The Baron never spoke of his past, and soon enough people stopped asking. He'd built the stable with meticulous care, importing craftsmen from back east, the finest materials, the best construction. Then he'd filled it with horses, thoroughbreds with bloodlines, traced back to Arabian deserts and English racing grounds. For a decade, the stable had been the pride of Dustridge. drawing buyers from 3 states to see the Baron's magnificent animals. Then something changed. The Baron grew suspicious, distrustful. He sold off his horses one by one and stopped accepting visitors. He hired no help, did all the work himself despite his advancing age. People saw him less and less, just occasional glimpses as he moved through town buying supplies, always looking over his shoulder, always counting his money twice, always hurrying back to that massive stable where he lived alone among empty stalls. When he died, there were no heirs, no family anyone knew of. The bank took possession of the property, but what could they do with a stable built for 40 horses in a town that barely needed facilities for 4? They'd listed it for auction with low expectations. The auction had taken place 3 days ago in the town square. Mayor Cornelius Blackwell had presided, his substantial belly straining against his vest buttons as he'd called for bids. Blackwell was the kind of man who measured his worth by the weight of his pocket watch and the deference shown by lesser folk. He owned half the commercial buildings in Dustridge and made sure everyone knew it. "Gentlemen," Blackwell had announced in his booming voice, "we have here the former property of the late Baron Von Gault, 40 stalls, 3-story structure, situated on 5 acres at the north edge of town. Prime real estate for the right buyer. Shall we start the bidding at $500? Silence had greeted his words. The stable was impressive, certainly, but it needed work. The roof leaked in places. Some of the stall doors hung crooked on rusted hinges, and what use did anyone have for such a massive facility? The cost of repairs alone would dwarf any reasonable return on investment. 400, Blackwell tried again, his confidence wavering slightly. More silence. Tyler Granger, the young banker who'd taken over when his father retired, smirked from his position near the front. At 28, Ty represented the new generation of Dustridge, men who'd grown up with privilege and wore it like armor against the struggles of ordinary folk. His suit was always pressed, his shoes always shined, and his contempt for men like Ethan was always barely concealed. 300? Blackwell's voice carried a note of desperation now. The bank wanted this property off its books. Ethan had been standing at the back of the small crowd, his hat in his hands. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about this moment, counting and recounting his money, weighing the risk against the dream, a roof over his head, a place to call his own. Maybe, if he worked hard enough, he could board horses for other people. $5 a month per horse. If he could attract even 4 or 5 regular boarders, he could make a modest living. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was honest, and it was possible. $127, Ethan had said, his voice quiet but clear. The crowd had turned to look at him. Someone laughed, then someone else. Soon the laughter rippled through the gathering like wind through wheat. "Penny wants to buy the palace," someone called out. "Mansion for his fleas," another voice added. Even Mayor Blackwell had smiled, though he tried to hide it behind a cough. "Mr. Wise, I'm afraid that bid is substantially below the property's value." "It's all I have," Ethan had replied simply. Ty Granger had actually slapped his knee. "This is rich. The town beggar wants to play gentleman farmer." Ethan had felt the familiar burn of shame in his chest, but he'd kept his face neutral. Shame was an old companion. He'd learned to live with it. Mayor Blackwell had looked around at the crowd, then back at Ethan. The mayor was pompous and self-important, but he wasn't entirely stupid. The bank wanted this property sold. Any sale was better than continuing to carry it on the books. "Any other bids?" Blackwell had asked, a formality at this point. Silence answered him. "Very well," the mayor had said, drawing out the words as if hoping someone would interrupt. "Going once at $127, going twice." He'd paused, looking around one final time. "Sold to Ethan Wise for $127. The laughter that followed had stung worse than any of it. Ethan had walked forward and handed over his leather pouch. 3 years of savings, exchanged for a deed that Ty Granger had filled out with obvious amusement. "Congratulations, Penny," Ty had said, not bothering to hide his smirk. You're now the proud owner of the biggest wreck in Dustridge. Don't spend all your remaining fortune on furniture. That had been 3 days ago. Now, standing before the stable in the early morning light, Ethan allowed himself to truly look at what he'd bought. The building was massive, far larger than he'd ever need, but it was his. The door hung slightly askew, and as he pushed it open, the hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the air smelled of old hay, dust, and years of neglect. Shafts of sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating floating motes of dust that danced in the still air. The stalls stretched away on both sides, empty and waiting. Some still had remnants of hay in their mangers. Others showed signs of the Baron's final, lonely years, scattered tools, empty feed sacks, bits of rope hanging from posts. Ethan walked slowly down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Each step felt significant, a man taking measure of his new life. He counted the stalls as he went. 40, just as advertised. More than he'd ever need, but perhaps that was all right. Perhaps having more than enough was its own kind of blessing after years of having less than nothing. At the far end of the stable, he found a small office. The door stood open, revealing a space that had clearly been the Baron's inner sanctum. A simple desk, a chair with a broken leg, shelves lined with empty bottles and scattered papers. A narrow cot in the corner suggested the Baron had lived here in his final months, abandoning even the small house that stood on the property. On the desk, beneath a layer of dust, Ethan found a leather-bound ledger. He picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The leather was fine quality, aged to a rich brown that spoke of better days. He opened it, revealing pages filled with neat, cramped handwriting. The entries made little sense at first glance. Columns of numbers with no clear labels, cryptic notes, north wall secure, changed locks, trust no one. Another page, moved 3 more today. They search, but they will never find. Pages and pages of similar entries, growing more frantic toward the end. The handwriting deteriorated, becoming shaky and erratic. The final entry was dated 2 weeks before the Baron's death. It is all here, all of it, hidden in plain sight where the blind will never see. Let them laugh, let them all laugh. They know nothing. Ethan closed the ledger slowly. The Baron had clearly lost his grip on reason in the end, driven mad by paranoia and isolation. It was a sad end for any man. He set the ledger back on the desk, a memorial to a life that had ended alone and afraid. But that wouldn't be Ethan's fate. He had plans, modest plans certainly, but honest ones. He'd clean this place from top to bottom. He'd repair what needed repairing. He'd make the small house on the property livable. Then he'd let it be known that he had room to board horses. With 40 stalls, he only needed a few clients to make a living. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan Wise had a home. He walked back outside, squinting in the bright morning sun. Across the road, he could see Sarah May Thornton opening her general store. Sarah was a widow, maybe 10 years his senior, with kind eyes and a gentle way about her. Her husband had died in a mining accident 15 years ago, and she'd run the store alone ever since. She'd always treated Ethan with dignity, even in his poorest days. She waved to him, and he waved back. One friendly face was more than he'd expected. He turned back to the stable, his stable, and rolled up his sleeves. There was work to do, and work was something Ethan Wise had never been afraid of. The townsfolk could laugh all they wanted. He had a roof over his head, a purpose, and for the first time in a long time, a glimmer of hope. That was more than enough to start with. The first week passed in a blur of labor that Ethan welcomed like an old friend. He rose with the sun each morning and worked until darkness made it impossible to see. The stable revealed its secrets slowly, room by room, stall by stall. Years of neglect had left their mark, but beneath the dust and cobwebs, the quality of the Baron's original construction showed through. He started with the small house on the property, a two-room structure that had once served as quarters for stable hands. The roof was sound, which was a blessing. The windows needed new glass in a few places, and the door had swollen in its frame from moisture, but these were problems he could handle. He scrubbed the floors, aired out the musty rooms, and moved his few belongings inside. A blanket, a spare shirt, a tin cup, and plate. A man didn't need much. At night, lying on the floor with his saddle for a pillow, he had no bed, yet Ethan allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. It was a small, quiet thing, this contentment, not the grand happiness of his youth or the pride he'd felt when he'd first owned his ranch. This was simpler, more fundamental. A roof overhead, walls around him, a door he could close against the world. These things mattered more than he'd ever imagined they could. During the day, he worked on the stable itself. He swept out decades of accumulated dust and debris. He repaired stall doors, replacing broken hinges and rotted boards. He climbed into the hayloft and patched the holes in the roof, carefully fitting new shingles where the old ones had blown away. The work was hard but satisfying, each small repair a step toward making this place his own. Sarah May had stopped by on the third day with a basket of food, fresh bread, cheese, and apples. "Thought you might be hungry," she'd said simply, not making a fuss about it. Her kindness had tightened something in Ethan's chest. He'd thanked her, and she'd waved off his gratitude with a smile that reminded him there was still good in the world. Doc Merriweather had visited on the fifth day, ostensibly to check that Ethan hadn't injured himself in the renovation. The doctor was in his 60s, with white hair and steady hands that had brought more than 100 babies into the world and eased twice that many souls out of it. He'd sat with Ethan on the steps of the stable, sharing coffee that Ethan had managed to afford now that he wasn't saving every penny. "Town's still talking about you," Doc had said, not unkindly. "I expect they are. You know what they're saying?" "I can guess." Doc had nodded, sipping his coffee. "Most of them are fools. A man who works with his hands and keeps his word is worth 10 of those who only know how to count other people's money." He'd paused, looking at the stable. "This is a good thing you're doing, Ethan, making something of this place. The Baron let it rot because he was afraid of shadows. You're bringing it back to life." Those words had meant more to Ethan than the old doctor could have known. By the end of the first week, Ethan had made real progress. The stable looked less like an abandoned wreck and more like a place that might actually house horses again. He'd even started thinking about how to spread the word that he had room for boarders. Maybe put up a notice at Sarah May's store, mention it to people he knew. It would start small, but that was fine. Small and honest was all he needed. On the 8th day, he turned his attention to the horse troughs. There were 40 of them, one for each stall. They were massive things, each one about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep, heavy beyond measure. The Baron had installed them permanently, bolting them to the floor and wall of each stall so they couldn't be moved or stolen. At the time, it had seemed like unnecessary precaution. Now abandoned and covered in years of grime, they were just another part of the stable that needed attention. The troughs were made of metal iron. Ethan had assumed painted a flat, matte black that had absorbed years of dust and dirt. The black paint had worn through in some places, revealing more metal beneath, still dark, but with a slightly different texture. Rust, Ethan figured, though the metal seemed to have held up remarkably well considering its age. He'd decided to clean them up and see if they were salvageable. If they were too far gone, he might be able to sell them for scrap. Every little bit helped when you were building a life from nothing. But first, he needed to see what he was working with. He started with the trough in the first stall, armed with a wire brush, rags, and a bucket of water mixed with lye soap. The accumulated filth came off slowly, years of dried mud, hay dust, and whatever else had settled on the surface. He scrubbed methodically, working in sections, revealing the black paint beneath. The work was tedious but oddly meditative. His mind wandered as his hands worked. He thought about the horses he might stable here. He thought about saving up enough to buy a decent bed. He thought about the coming winter and the work he'd need to do to make sure the place was properly sealed against Montana's brutal cold. After 2 hours, he'd cleaned the first trough thoroughly. The black paint gleamed dully in the light, streaming through the stall's window. He ran his hand over the surface, feeling for rough spots or places where rust might have eaten through. The metal felt smooth, almost silky under his fingers. That was good. Maybe these troughs would last longer than he'd feared. He moved to the second stall and began the same process. This trough was in worse shape, the paint more chipped and worn. In several places, the underlying metal showed through clearly, catching the light with an odd, yellowish gleam. Ethan paused, looking more closely at one of these spots. The exposed metal didn't look like iron. It looked too smooth, too uniform. And that color iron didn't have that warm yellow cast. Brass, maybe. But brass was expensive. Why would the Baron use brass for horse troughs? Ethan pulled out his knife, a simple folding blade he'd owned for 20 years. He opened it and carefully scraped at the edge of one of the worn spots, applying gentle pressure. The blade bit into something soft, definitely not iron. Metal shavings curled away from the knife's edge, falling to the floor of the stall. He bent down and picked up one of the shavings, holding it up to the light. It gleamed with that same warm yellow color. His heart began to beat faster, though he couldn't have said exactly why. He scraped a bit more, creating a small gouge in the metal beneath the paint. The color was consistent all the way through, not just a coating or plating, solid yellow metal. Ethan's hands had started to shake. He knew what brass looked like. He'd seen it on belt buckles, on decorative fixtures in wealthy homes. This looked like brass, but it was too soft. His knife had cut into it too easily. Brass was harder than this. You couldn't gouge brass with a folding knife without real effort. He thought about the ledger he'd found in the Baron's office, the cryptic notes. It is all here, all of it, hidden in plain sight where the blind will never see. No, it couldn't be. He scraped harder, his knife cutting a deeper groove into the metal. More shavings fell away, each one gleaming yellow in the morning light. He dropped the knife and grabbed the wire brush, scrubbing frantically at the black paint. It flaked away under the aggressive assault, revealing more of that yellow metal beneath. Ethan stood up, his legs unsteady. He walked to the stable door and looked out at the town beyond. Normal. Everything looked normal, the sun shining, people going about their business, the world unchanged. He turned back to the trough, his mind racing. He needed to be sure, needed to know beyond any shadow of doubt. There was a test. He'd heard about it once, years ago. Gold was heavy, much heavier than iron or brass. You could tell by the weight. He found a hammer and chisel in the Baron's scattered tools. His hands shook as he positioned the chisel against the black paint on a section of the trough that hadn't been damaged. He struck it once, twice, 3 times. A chunk of paint fell away, revealing a patch of yellow metal the size of his palm. Ethan touched the exposed metal, feeling its smoothness, its warmth. He pressed his thumb against it, hard. The metal gave slightly under the pressure, leaving a faint impression. Iron wouldn't do that. Brass wouldn't do that. Only one metal would. He sat down hard on the floor of the stall, his back against the wall. His breath came in short gasps. Around him, 40 stalls stretched away in both directions. In each stall, a massive trough, bolted permanently to the floor and walls, each one painted black, each one heavy beyond reason. The Baron hadn't been mad, or if he had been, his madness had method. He'd hidden his fortune in plain sight, disguised as common stable equipment, tons of it, literal tons of gold, painted black and used as horse troughs, where anyone could see them but no one would ever think to look. Ethan put his head in his hands and laughed, a sound caught somewhere between joy and disbelief. The town had mocked him for buying a mansion for his fleas. They'd laughed at poor Penny Wise and his foolish dreams. They had no idea what he'd really bought. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He lay on the floor of his small house, staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning through calculations that made his head ache. 40 troughs, each one approximately 6 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet. He tried to remember the weight of gold. Heavy, impossibly heavy. A cubic foot of gold weighed something like 1,200 pounds, if he remembered right from conversations he'd overheard in assayers' offices years ago. Each trough held roughly 36 cubic feet. If they were solid gold, and he still couldn't quite believe it, even having seen the evidence with his own eyes, each one would weigh over 40,000 pounds. 20 tons per trough. 40 troughs meant 800 tons of gold. The number was so absurd he couldn't process it. 800 tons. He didn't even know how to calculate what that would be worth. Millions of dollars, tens of millions, more wealth than existed in the entire Montana territory, sitting in his stable disguised as common horse troughs. Unless he was wrong, unless his mind, desperate from years of poverty, was seeing gold where there was only brass or some other yellow metal. He needed to be certain. He needed proof that wouldn't let him fool himself. Before dawn, he rose and walked back to the stable. The building loomed in the darkness, silent and massive. He lit a lantern and carried it to the second stall where he'd made his discovery. The gouge he'd carved yesterday gleamed yellow in the lamplight, mocking him with its implications. He needed an expert, but that presented a problem. If word got out about what he'd found, he'd never be safe again. The town that had mocked him would descend on this place like locusts. Mayor Blackwell would find some legal mechanism to seize the property. Ty Granger and the bank would claim fraud in the sale. Even if he managed to keep legal title, he'd spend the rest of his life fighting off thieves and claim jumpers. No, he couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he needed to know for certain. Doc Merriweather. The thought came to him as the sun began to lighten the eastern sky. The old doctor had studied at a university back east. He'd have access to books, to knowledge beyond what most people in Dustridge possessed. More importantly, he was discreet. A doctor kept confidences. It was part of his nature. Ethan carved a small piece of metal from the trough using his knife and chisel. It took 20 minutes of careful work, but he eventually freed a chunk about the size of a bean. He wrapped it in a clean rag and put it in his pocket. Then he covered his work with an old feed sack, hiding the exposed metal from casual view. The walk to Doc Merriweather's office took 15 minutes. The sun had fully risen by the time Ethan knocked on the door of the small house that served as both the doctor's home and practice. He half expected to find no one awake at this early hour, but the door opened after just a moment. Doc Merriweather stood there in his shirt sleeves, reading spectacles perched on his nose. "Ethan, what brings you by so early? Are you hurt?" "No, sir. I need your help with something else. Something private." The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he stepped back and gestured Ethan inside. They went to his office, a room lined with medical books and bottles of various tinctures. The smell of carbolic and camphor hung in the air. "What can I do for you?" Doc asked, settling into his chair. Ethan pulled out the rag and unwrapped it, revealing the small chunk of yellow metal. He set it on the doctor's desk. "I need to know what this is." Doc Merriweather picked up the metal, turning it over in his fingers. His expression shifted from curious to focused. He reached for a drawer and pulled out a small brass weight used for measuring doses. He compared the two metals, rubbing them with his thumb, testing their relative hardness. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "I need to know what it is first." The doctor was silent for a long moment, studying the metal. Then he stood and went to his bookshelf. He pulled down a thick volume and flipped through it until he found what he was looking for. He read for a minute, then looked back at the metal, then at Ethan. "This is gold," he said finally. "I'm quite certain of it. The color, the malleability, the weight, it all matches. Where did you find it?" Ethan had prepared for this question, but now that it came, he found himself hesitating. Trust was a luxury he'd rarely been able to afford, but he needed advice, needed someone who could help him think through what came next. "I found it in the stable," he said carefully. "I'd like to keep that between us, if you're willing." Doc Merriweather set the metal down and removed his spectacles, cleaning them with a handkerchief. "The Baron's stable, of course. That explains some things." "What things?" "The Baron came to see me about 3 months before he died. He wasn't sick, mind you, just wanted to talk. Old men sometimes need that." The doctor paused, remembering. "He told me that he'd spent his whole life acquiring wealth, and he'd realized too late that the acquiring had cost him everything else. No family, no friends, no one to leave his fortune to. He said he'd hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere the taxmen and the thieves would never think to look." I assumed he was rambling. "His mind wasn't what it used to be." "He wasn't rambling," Ethan said quietly. "No, apparently not." Doc Merriweather looked at Ethan with concern. "This puts you in a difficult position. That's why I'm here. I need to think through what to do." The doctor nodded slowly. "First question, is there more?" Ethan almost laughed. "Yes, much more." "How much more?" "I think all of it. Everything the Baron had. It's all there, disguised as something ordinary." Doc Merriweather was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and went to his window, looking out at the street beyond. "You can't tell anyone else. You understand that, don't you? The moment this becomes known, your life will never be safe again." "I know. You'll need to be careful. Very careful. And you'll need to think long-term. Gold in that quantity, you can't just sell it. Not without attracting exactly the kind of attention you don't want." "I haven't thought that far ahead yet. I'm still trying to believe it's real." The doctor turned back to face him. "It's real, and it's going to change your life in ways you can't begin to imagine. The question is, what kind of man do you want to be? Will this fortune make you or destroy you?" Ethan thought about the ledger in the Baron's office, the paranoid scrawlings of a man who'd let his wealth consume him, a man who died alone, trusting no one, surrounded by his fortune and having no one to share it with. "I don't want to end up like the Baron," Ethan said. "Then don't let the gold become your whole life. Remember what matters. Remember the man you were before you found it." Doc Merriweather came back to his desk and sat down. "But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, you need to verify what you've found and make sure no one else discovers it. Keep working on the stable. Act normal. Don't change your behavior or your spending. If people notice you acting differently, they'll start asking questions. That won't be hard. I don't have any money to spend anyway." "Good. Keep it that way for now." The doctor picked up the chunk of gold and handed it back to Ethan. "Go home. Think carefully. And if you need counsel, you know where to find me. I'll keep your secret." Ethan took the gold and wrapped it back in the rag. "Thank you, Doc. I mean that. Just don't let it change you, Ethan. You're a good man, the kind who works hard and keeps his word. That's worth more than all the gold in Montana." Walking back to the stable, Ethan turned those words over in his mind. Worth more than all the gold in Montana. He wanted to believe that, needed to believe it. Because right now, he literally had most of the gold in Montana sitting in his stable, and it terrified him more than poverty ever had. 3 weeks passed. Ethan continued his work on the stable, acting as normal as he could manage. He repaired doors. He patched the roof. He swept and cleaned, always careful to leave the black-painted troughs untouched beyond that first one he'd tested. To anyone watching, he was just a poor man trying to make something of his unlikely purchase. But alone at night, his mind wouldn't rest. He'd verified the gold in 3 more troughs, always careful to conceal his testing. Each one was the same, solid gold beneath the black paint. The full reality of what he owned pressed down on him like a physical weight. He was probably the wealthiest man in the entire Western Territories, and he couldn't tell a soul. Sarah May had stopped by twice more with food, and each time Ethan had to force himself to act grateful, but not too grateful, accepting her kindness as a poor man would, not as someone who could buy her store 100 times over. The deception felt wrong, but Doc Merriweather had been clear. Any change in behavior would raise questions. On a Tuesday morning, while sorting through more of the Baron's belongings in the office, Ethan found something that made his blood run cold. Behind a loose board in the wall, tucked into a space that had clearly been deliberately created, was a stack of letters bound with string. He untied the string and began reading. The letters were addressed to Baron Von Gault, and they spanned a period of about 5 years before his death. The first few were innocuous, business correspondence from what appeared to be a mining concern in Nevada. But as Ethan continued reading, the tone changed. One letter, dated 4 years before the Baron's death, read, "We know you took more than your share when you left. We know you have it somewhere. This isn't over, Von Gault. We have long memories and longer reach. You can't hide forever." Another, from 2 years later, "Our associates in Montana report you're living like a hermit. What's the matter, old man? Afraid we'll find what you stole? You were always clever, but you're not clever enough. We'll find it eventually, and when we do, we'll find you too." The most recent letter was dated just 3 months before the Baron's death. "You win, Von Gault. We're done looking. Whatever hole you buried it in, it can stay there. But know this, you'll die alone with your precious fortune, and it won't buy you a single friend or a moment of peace. Enjoy your victory, you paranoid fool." Ethan's hands trembled as he set the letters down. The Baron hadn't been crazy, or rather, his paranoia had been entirely justified. Someone had been hunting him, searching for his fortune. These letters confirmed what the ledger had suggested. The Baron had fled Nevada with wealth that others believed they were entitled to. Whether he'd stolen it or simply taken what was rightfully his, Ethan would never know. But the Baron had spent his final years looking over his shoulder, trusting no one, dying alone because his fear of losing his fortune was greater than his need for human connection. The letters raised a troubling question. Did these people, whoever they were, still care? The last letter suggested they'd given up. But if word got out that someone had found the Baron's hidden fortune, would they come back? Would they decide that what they couldn't find, they could simply take from whoever had it now? Ethan thought about his earlier fantasy of buying the town, of turning the tables on everyone who'd mocked him. It had been a pleasant daydream, a moment of imagined revenge. But these letters showed him what that path really led to: suspicion, fear, isolation. The Baron had died with everything and nothing. Ethan didn't want that fate. He burned the letters in his stove that night, watching the paper curl and blacken. Whatever threats had pursued the Baron, Ethan wouldn't give them fuel by keeping evidence of the old man's fears. Let the past stay buried. But the letters had accomplished one thing. They'd clarified his thinking. He couldn't keep all of this gold. The sheer magnitude of it would destroy him just as it had destroyed the Baron. But he also couldn't simply give it away or abandon it. He'd bought this property honestly. Whatever was on it was legally his. He needed a plan that fell somewhere in between. The next morning, he visited the small church at the edge of town. Reverend Thomas was a thin man in his 50s who'd served the community for 20 years. He was hanging new curtains in the sanctuary when Ethan arrived. "Mr. Wise," the Reverend greeted him with genuine warmth. "Good to see you. How's the stable coming along?" "It's coming. I wonder if I might speak with you about something." They sat in the front pew, and Ethan chose his words carefully. "Reverend, if a man came into unexpected resources, nothing illegal, just unexpected, and he wanted to use some of that to help the community, how would you suggest he go about it?" Reverend Thomas studied him thoughtfully. "That's an interesting question. I'd say it depends on the man's motivations. Is he looking to help out of genuine charity, or is he trying to buy goodwill?" "Genuine charity. This man knows what it's like to have nothing. He doesn't want others to suffer the same way, if he can prevent it." "Then I'd say start small and local. Find the people who need help most and help them quietly. Don't make a show of it. Real charity doesn't need an audience." The Reverend paused. "Is this hypothetical man you, Ethan?" Ethan smiled slightly. Maybe someday. Right now I'm still trying to make the stable profitable. But a man can think ahead. That he can. The Reverend stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town. You know what this community needs most. Not grand gestures or big donations. We need hope. We need to see that hard work and honest living can still lead to something better. That's what you're already giving us, Ethan. By taking that abandoned stable and making something of it, you're showing people that it's possible to start over. That matters more than money ever could. The words struck Ethan deeply. He'd been so focused on the gold, on what it meant and what he should do with it, that he'd forgotten what he'd actually set out to do, make an honest living. The gold was there, yes, it would always be there, but it didn't have to define him or his life. Thank you, Reverend. That helps more than you know. Walking back to the stable, Ethan felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. He would keep his secret. He would continue his work. And when the time was right, when he'd figured out how to do it safely and wisely, he would find ways to help the community that had once mocked him. Not out of revenge or pride, but out of genuine desire to lift others up, the way Doc Merriweather and Sarah May and even Reverend Thomas had lifted him. The gold could wait, his life couldn't. That afternoon, he finished repairing the last of the stall doors and stood back to survey his work. The stable looked better than it had in years, clean, organized, functional, ready for horses if any came, ready for whatever the future held. In the first stall, hidden beneath an old feed sack, a golden trough gleamed in the shadows. Ethan didn't look at it. Instead, he locked the stable and headed to his small house. He had beans and cornbread for dinner, same as he'd had for years. The simple meal tasted good, honest, real. Some things were worth more than gold. He was beginning to understand that. The first real test came 6 weeks after his discovery. Ethan was in Sarah May's general store, buying coffee and flour with money he'd earned, doing odd jobs around town, when Ty Granger walked in. The young banker had his usual air of superiority, his suit pressed, and his shoes shined despite the dusty streets outside. "Mrs. Thornton," Ty said, tipping his hat to Sarah May. Then he noticed Ethan. "Ah, Penny. Still living in your palace?" "Still working on it," Ethan replied evenly. "I'm sure you are." Ty leaned against the counter, clearly in no hurry to leave. "You know, it's funny. I was going through the bank's records, and I realized we made a significant error in that auction." Ethan's heart began to beat faster, but he kept his face neutral. The property was assessed incorrectly. The stable, the land, the outbuildings, all of it should have had a minimum bid of at least $800. We effectively gave away bank property for a fraction of its value. Ty smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The bank's board is considering whether the sale should be voided. Sarah May, who'd been watching this exchange, spoke up. "The auction was conducted properly, Mr. Granger. The mayor himself presided over it. If the bank made an error in assessment, that's not Mr. Wise's problem." "Perhaps not legally," Ty conceded, "but there are other considerations. For instance, the property taxes on that land are based on its assessed value. If we revise that assessment upward, which we certainly should, Mr. Wise might find the annual taxes rather burdensome, say $50 or $60 a year. River, 14 demands. River numentand 14 demanner, mytina manna spredendolv the Pessover, 14 demanus, riven tendolv the Pessover." Ethan felt the trap closing. $50 a year would be devastating for a man with no income beyond occasional labor. That was exactly Ty's point. The banker wanted to force Ethan to sell the property back to the bank, probably for a small profit that would humiliate Ethan while enriching Ty's friends, who would then buy it at a proper auction. "I'll manage," Ethan said quietly. "Will you? You're barely scraping by as it is. How long before you default on those taxes and we have to seize the property anyway?" Ty straightened up, preparing to leave. "Just something to think about, Penny. The bank is prepared to be generous. We'll buy the property back from you for $200. Double your investment." "That's fair, isn't it?" After Ty left, Sarah May shook her head. "That boy is mean as a snake. His father knew how to do business without trying to grind people into the dirt, but he takes pleasure in it. The taxes, Ethan said. Can they really do that? They can reassess, yes. Whether they should is another question. The stable's been sitting empty for months. Its value hasn't magically increased just because you bought it. She paused. But if they want to make trouble for you, they can probably find a way. Ethan thanked her and left with his purchases. The walk back to the stable felt longer than usual. He'd known this life wouldn't be simple, but he hadn't anticipated the bank actively working against him. $60 a year in property taxes. He could pay it, of course. The chunk of gold he'd tested was worth more than that, but to pay it would raise questions about where a poor cowboy got that kind of money. He could take that small piece of gold to an assayer in another town, claim he'd found it prospecting, use the money to pay the taxes and have enough left over to live on for a while. But even that carried risk. Word traveled. People would wonder why a man who'd found a nugget of gold would stay in a broken-down stable instead of going back to prospect for more. Every solution created new problems. Every move he considered would draw attention he couldn't afford. That evening, Doc Merriweather came by unannounced. The old doctor looked troubled. I heard about Ty's visit to the store. Sarah May told me. News travels fast. It's a small town. Everyone knows everyone's business. Doc sat on the steps of the stable beside Ethan. He's testing you. Seeing if you'll crack under pressure. I won't. I don't doubt that. But here's something you should know. Ty's been asking questions. Nothing direct, but he's been wondering aloud why you bought the stable, suggesting there must be something valuable about the property that you knew, and he didn't. Ethan felt a chill run through him. Most just laugh. They figure you're a fool who wanted a roof over your head and didn't think it through. But Ty's not stupid. He's young and arrogant, but not stupid. If he starts looking into the Baron's background, he starts wondering why the old man built such an elaborate stable and then lived in it alone. He might start asking the right questions. What should I do? Give him another explanation, something that makes sense and satisfies his curiosity. Doc was quiet for a moment, thinking, what if you did start boarding horses? Just a few. Charge reasonable rates. It would give you legitimate income, explain why you bought the place, and make the property seem ordinary. It was a good suggestion, but Ethan saw the problem immediately. Horses would be in and out of those stalls. They'd damage the troughs. Someone might notice the paint chipping and see what's underneath. Then don't use those stalls. You have 40 of them. Use the ones on the second floor of the hayloft. I noticed there are some smaller stalls up there for ponies or sick animals. Keep the ground floor closed off. Say you're still working on repairs down there. Ethan considered this. It could work. It would look normal, give him a reason to be at the stable constantly, and provide legitimate income that would explain how he was paying his bills. The risks seemed manageable. I'll think about it, he said. Don't think too long. Ty's not going to let this go. He's embarrassed that he let the property slip through his fingers for so little, and he's the kind of man who needs to win. Doc stood up. I should get back. But Ethan, be careful. The gold is yours, legally and morally, but that won't matter if the wrong people find out about it. They'll find ways to take it from you, law or no law. After the doctor left, Ethan sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about his options. He'd spent his whole life being honest, working hard, playing by the rules. The gold hadn't changed that. He still wanted to live honorably, to build something legitimate. But the world didn't always reward honesty. Sometimes it punished it. He thought about the Baron, hiding in his stable, trusting no one, dying alone. Was that Ethan's future? Would protecting this fortune require him to become the kind of man he'd never wanted to be, suspicious, isolated, afraid? No, he wouldn't let it come to that. Doc's suggestion was sound. He'd start boarding horses. He'd make the business legitimate. He'd pay his taxes with honest income. The gold could stay hidden, untouched, a secret that would die with him if necessary. But even as he made this resolution, doubt nagged at him. Could he really keep this secret forever? Could any man? Within a week, Ethan had his first customer. Martha Donovan was a widow who lived on a small farm 2 miles outside town. She owned an aging mare that needed shelter during the harsh Montana winters, and she'd heard through Sarah May that Ethan was looking to board horses. $5 a month seemed fair to her, and Ethan was grateful for both the income and the legitimacy it provided. He'd prepared one of the upper stalls carefully, far from the gold-filled troughs below. The stall was clean, well ventilated, with fresh hay and a simple wooden trough for water. Not gold. Just honest wood that had seen better days, but still served its purpose. Martha brought the mare on a crisp October morning. The horse was a gentle chestnut named Rosie, 30 years old if she was a day, with white around her muzzle and a patient disposition. She settled into her new stall without fuss, and Martha paid Ethan the first month's fee with obvious relief. "She's been with me since I was a young bride," Martha said, stroking Rosie's neck. "My late husband gave her to me. I know she doesn't have many years left, but I want her comfortable." "She'll be well cared for," Ethan promised. Word spread slowly but surely. A rancher named Tom Bidwell brought his daughter's pony, a spirited little Appaloosa that required more patience than Rosie, but paid the same $5 a month. Then came Henry Walsh with 2 draft horses that he used for ploughing but couldn't house properly over winter. Henry paid $10 a month, and suddenly Ethan had $20 in legitimate monthly income. It wasn't wealth, but it was honest money that would cover his basic needs and start to accumulate toward the property taxes. More importantly, it gave him a reason to be at the stable constantly, and it made his ownership of the property seem sensible rather than foolish. The horses also gave him something he hadn't expected: companionship. He'd spent so long alone that he'd forgotten the simple pleasure of caring for another living creature. Rosie would nicker when she heard his footsteps. The Appaloosa pony, whose name was Dusty, would nuzzle his pockets looking for treats. Even Henry's big draft horses, stolid and workmanlike, seemed content in their stalls. Ethan found himself talking to them as he worked, sharing thoughts he couldn't share with any person. "You know what's funny?" he said to Rosie one afternoon while brushing her coat. "Everyone thinks I'm barely getting by, and they're right to think it. But underneath you, just below these floorboards, there's enough gold to buy this whole territory 10 times over." Rosie flicked her ears and continued eating her hay, unimpressed by revelations of hidden fortune. But if the horses provided comfort, the human world continued to present complications. Mayor Blackwell stopped by one November morning, his considerable bulk wrapped in a heavy coat against the cold. He toured the stable with the air of a man inspecting property he believed should have been his. "I see you're making a go of it," Blackwell said, not quite managing to hide his disappointment. "Boarding horses. Clever, I suppose. It's honest work." "Indeed." Blackwell ran his hand along one of the stall doors. "You know, I've been thinking about the Baron. Strange man. Lived here for 20 years, and nobody really knew him. Makes you wonder what he was hiding." Ethan kept his voice level. "I don't think he was hiding anything, Mayor. I think he was just lonely." "Perhaps." Blackwell moved toward the stairs leading down to the ground floor. "Mind if I look around?" "Actually, I do." Ethan stepped between the mayor and the stairs. "The ground floor isn't safe yet. Rotted boards, weak beams. I'm working on repairs, but until they're done, I can't let anyone down there. Liability." It wasn't entirely a lie. There were some boards that needed replacing, but mostly Ethan couldn't risk anyone seeing the massive black troughs and getting curious. Blackwell's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see. Well, safety first, I suppose." He turned to leave, then paused. "The county assessor will be making his rounds next month. He'll need to tour the property to determine the proper tax rate. You'll need to make it accessible by then." After Blackwell left, Ethan stood in the cold stable, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The walls were closing in, Ty Granger pressuring him to sell, the mayor suspicious and probing, the assessor coming to evaluate the property. Each day brought new risks, new chances for his secret to be discovered. That night, he pulled out the Baron's ledger again, reading through the frantic entries with new understanding. The Baron had lived like this for years, always watching, always worried, always afraid that someone would discover the truth. It had consumed him, turned him from whatever he'd been into a frightened hermit who died alone. Ethan wouldn't let that happen to him, but how could he prevent it? The gold was there, it wasn't going away. As long as it sat in his stable, it was a ticking clock, counting down to the moment when someone would finally look too closely and see what he'd been hiding. A knock on his door startled him from these dark thoughts. He opened it to find Sarah May standing there with a covered basket. "I made too much stew," she said, which they both knew was a kind fiction. "Thought you might like some." He invited her in, and they sat at his small table sharing the meal. Sarah had a way of making conversation feel easy, never prying but always present. She talked about her day at the store, about the weather turning colder, about small kindnesses and minor frustrations. "You seem troubled," she said finally. "Just tired. It's been a long few months." "You've done well, Ethan, taking that wreck of a stable and turning it into something useful. People are starting to talk differently about you. Less mockery, more respect." "Are they? Tom Bidwell told me yesterday that you were smart to buy when you did. Said the property was undervalued and you had an eye for opportunity." She smiled. "That's quite different from what people were saying 2 months ago." Ethan felt an odd pang at her words. The town's changing perception of him was based on a misunderstanding. They thought he was clever. They thought he'd seen something they'd missed and taken advantage of it. They weren't wrong, exactly, but they didn't know the half of it. "What if I told you I just got lucky?" he said quietly. "Luck favors the prepared," my mother used to say. "You worked hard, you saved your money, you took a chance when you had the opportunity. That's not just luck, Ethan. That's character." After she left, Ethan sat in the darkness of his small house, thinking about her words. Character. Was it character to keep a secret this big, or was it cowardice? He honestly didn't know anymore. Outside, the wind howled across the Montana plains, rattling his windows and reminding him that winter was coming. In the stable, 5 horses stood in their stalls, warm and safe. Below them, hidden beneath decades of black paint, enough gold to transform a territory sat in plain sight. And Ethan Wise, poor cowboy turned secret millionaire, tried to figure out how to live with both realities at once. The stranger arrived on a grey December afternoon when snow had just begun to fall. Ethan was in the stable, feeding the horses, when he heard the sound of a wagon pulling up outside. He stepped out to see an old man climbing down from the driver's seat, his movements slow and careful. The man was at least 70, possibly older, with a long white beard and eyes that held both intelligence and weariness. He wore a heavy coat that had seen better days, and he carried himself with a dignity that spoke of education and refinement despite his obviously modest circumstances. "Mr. Wise?" the old man asked. "That's right. My name is Augustus Pemberton. I was Baron Von Gault's attorney. I wonder if I might speak with you about the property you purchased." Ethan's heart sank. An attorney. This was exactly the kind of complication he'd feared. "The sale was legal," he said carefully. "I have the deed." "I'm not here to challenge the sale," Pemberton assured him. "Might we speak somewhere private?" They went to Ethan's small house. Ethan made coffee while Pemberton settled into the only chair. The old attorney pulled a leather portfolio from his coat and set it on the table. "I've traveled from Nevada to find you," Pemberton began. "It took some time to learn who had purchased the Baron's property. I have something I need to deliver to you, and I need to explain some things about Baron Von Gault that may surprise you." "I'm listening." Pemberton opened the portfolio and withdrew a sealed envelope. "Before I give you this, I need to tell you the Baron's story. The true story, not the rumors that followed him." Over the next hour, Pemberton laid out a tale that was both simpler and more complex than the speculation that had swirled around the Baron for years. Baron Von Gault, whose real name had been Wilhelm Gault, had indeed made his fortune in Nevada silver mines. But he hadn't stolen it. He'd been a mining engineer, brilliant and honest, who'd discovered a massive silver deposit on land he'd legally filed claims on. Wilhelm spent 5 years extracting that silver, Pemberton explained. He became wealthy beyond measure. 3 men who'd initially dismissed the land as worthless decided they wanted a larger share. They couldn't challenge his legal claims, so they began threatening him. Harassment at first, then violence. The letters Ethan had found made sense now. Those hadn't been threats from wronged partners. They'd been threats from greedy men who wanted wealth they hadn't earned. Wilhelm sold his claims for a fraction of their value and left Nevada with his fortune. He came here hoping to find peace, but the threats followed him. He'd converted much of his wealth to gold because it was easier to hide than certificates or bank accounts, and he became convinced that someone would eventually find him and take what he'd worked so hard to acquire. So he disguised it, Ethan said quietly. Pemberton looked at him sharply. You know, I found it, the troughs. The old attorney nodded slowly. Then you understand the position you're in. Wilhelm spent the last 20 years of his life guarding that fortune, and it destroyed him. He died alone, paranoid, unable to trust anyone. Pemberton pushed the envelope across the table. He wrote this letter 5 years before his death, when he still had some clarity. He asked me to hold it and to deliver it to whoever eventually came to own the property. Ethan opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter written in the same neat hand that had filled the ledger, but without the frantic quality of the later entries. To whoever finds this, the letter began. If you are reading this, I am dead, and you have discovered what I spent my life hiding. I write this now while I still have my reason, before the fear takes me completely. The gold is yours by right of purchase, but I implore you do not let it consume you as it consumed me. I thought wealth would bring me security and happiness. Instead, it brought me only fear and isolation. By the time I understood this, it was too late to change course. I have no heirs, no family, no one to leave this fortune to. I considered giving it away, but I convinced myself I was keeping it safe, protecting it. The truth is simpler and sadder. I couldn't let it go. It had become my identity, my purpose, my prison. If you are poor, as I suspect you might be, for only someone desperate would buy this white elephant of a stable, you now have the means to transform your life. But I beg you, do not make my mistakes. Do not let the gold become your whole world. Use it wisely, share it generously, and above all, do not let it cost you your humanity. There is one more thing. Hidden in the foundation of the stable's northeast corner, beneath a loose stone marked with an X, you will find a small safe. Inside is documentation of the gold's origin, proving it was legally acquired. You will need this if anyone ever questions your ownership. Also, in the safe is a list of charitable institutions I always meant to support but never did. If you have any kindness in your heart, consider honoring these intentions that I was too frightened to honor myself. I die alone, wealthy beyond measure, and poor beyond redemption. Do better than I did. Wilhelm Gault. Ethan read the letter twice, his eyes burning. The Baron hadn't been a villain or a thief. He'd been a man who'd made one terrible mistake. He'd let his wealth define him. The safe, Pemberton said. Wilhelm told me about it years ago. He wanted to ensure that whoever found the gold would have legal protection. The documentation inside proves the gold was legally acquired through legitimate mining operations. It should shield you from any claims. And the list of charities? Wilhelm always meant to be generous. He talked about it constantly in his early years here, but fear kept him from acting on those impulses. He was afraid that giving away money would attract attention, would lead people to ask where it came from. Pemberton stood, his old bones creaking. I've done my duty. The rest is up to you, Mr. Wise. After the attorney left, Ethan sat alone with the letter, reading it again and again. The Baron had seen his own future and tried to warn against it. Use it wisely, share it generously. Do not let it cost you your humanity. That afternoon, with snow falling steadily outside, Ethan went to the stable and found the northeast corner of the foundation. It took him an hour of searching, but he finally located a stone marked with a faint X. Behind it, set into the wall, was a small iron safe. The safe wasn't locked. Inside, he found exactly what the letter had promised: legal documents proving the gold's origin, assay certificates, mining claim records, all meticulously organized. And beneath these, a single sheet of paper listing 20 institutions: hospitals, schools, orphanages, churches. Ethan carried the documents back to his house and spread them on his table. The proof of legal ownership changed everything. He could claim the gold openly now, prove it was his, defend his right to it in any court. But as he sat there, looking at the Baron's neat handwriting on the charity list, he realized something. The Baron had given him more than legal protection. He'd given him a roadmap out of the trap that had destroyed the old man's life. The gold was real, it was his, it was legal, and now, finally, he knew what he was going to do with it. Not everything, not all at once, but enough to honor the Baron's intended generosity, enough to help the community that had once mocked him, enough to prove that wealth didn't have to destroy the man who held it. The Baron had died alone, wealthy and miserable. Ethan Wise would not make the same mistake. He pulled out a piece of paper and began making his own list, thinking about what Dustridge needed most, about the people who'd shown him kindness when he had nothing, about the kind of legacy he wanted to build. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the town in white, making everything look clean and new. A fresh start. That's what this was. Not just for Ethan, but for the whole community. If he was wise enough to handle it right. The weeks following Pemberton's visit were the most intense of Ethan's life. He spent his days caring for the boarded horses and his nights planning how to handle the fortune that sat beneath his feet. The Baron's letter had given him clarity of purpose, but the path forward was treacherous with complications. His first step was to consult with Doc Merriweather. The old physician listened to the story of Pemberton's visit and the Baron's letter with the careful attention he brought to all serious matters. "You're thinking of revealing it," Doc said. It wasn't a question. Some of it, not all at once, but enough to start making a difference. Ethan spread the Baron's charity list on the doctor's desk. He wanted to help these places. I want to honor that. But I also want to help here, in Dustridge, people who need it. The moment you start spending money, people will ask where it came from. I have the documentation Pemberton brought. Proof that the gold was legally acquired. If I claim I found it while renovating the stable, which is true, and show the paperwork, the law should protect me. The law, maybe, but what about the people who'll suddenly want to be your friend? The family members who'll crawl out of nowhere claiming kinship? The swindlers and con men who'll descend on you like locusts? Doc leaned back in his chair. Wilhelm Gault feared those things for good reason. I know. That's why I need to be smart about this. Measured. I can't just start throwing money around. They spent hours that evening developing a strategy. Ethan would claim to have found a significant amount of gold, not all of it, just enough to explain modest wealth while renovating the stable. He'd show the legal documentation to the bank and the mayor, establishing his legitimate ownership. Then he'd begin making carefully considered donations and investments, building a reputation as a generous but not extravagant man. You'll need to sell some of the gold, Doc pointed out. Carefully and in small amounts, different assayers in different towns, spread out over time, nothing that would draw attention or flood the market. I've thought about that. I can take a piece of one trough, maybe 20 pounds of gold, sell it over the course of a year through various channels. That would give me enough operating capital to start helping people. 20 pounds. Doc did the quick calculation. At current prices, that's around $5,000, more than most people in this town will see in a lifetime. Exactly. enough to make a real difference, but not so much that it seems impossible for a man who found a hidden cache. But even as they refined the plan, external pressures continued to mount. The county assessor, a pinch-faced man named Silas Morton, arrived 2 days before Christmas. He'd been delayed by early snow, which had given Ethan more time to prepare, but now the moment had come. Morton toured the upper level of the stable with obvious disappointment. Just boarding horses? That's your business model? It's honest work, I suppose. Morton made notes on his clipboard. Now I'll need to inspect the ground floor. The mayor indicated there are some unique features down there that affect the property's value. Ethan had prepared for this, of course, but I should tell you something first. He led Morton to his small office, the same room where he'd found the Baron's ledger, and showed him the documentation Pemberton had brought. I discovered something while working on the property. Hidden gold, part of the Baron's estate. I have proof of its legal origin. Morton's eyes widened as he looked through the papers. This is how much gold are we talking about? A significant amount. I'm still assessing the full extent, but enough to change the property's value considerably. I'll need to see it. This was the moment Ethan had been rehearsing in his mind for weeks. He led Morton down to the ground floor and showed him one of the troughs. Using his knife, he carefully scraped away a section of black paint, revealing the yellow metal beneath. Morton's hand shook as he touched the exposed gold. My God! The Baron hid his fortune as stable equipment. It appears so. I verified several of these troughs. They're all the same, solid gold painted to look like iron. Do you have any idea what this is worth? Millions, I expect, but I'm not interested in selling all of it. Some will go to the charities the Baron intended to support. Some I'll use to help this community. The rest will remain here, secure, until I decide what to do with it. Morton stared at him. You're the wealthiest man in Montana, maybe in the entire territory, and you're living in a 2-room house, boarding horses for $5 a month. For now, wealth like this requires careful handling. I saw what it did to the Baron, made him paranoid and isolated. I won't let that happen to me. The assessor left with a promise to keep the discovery confidential until Ethan was ready to make a public announcement. Ethan didn't entirely trust that promise. Morton was fundamentally a bureaucrat who followed rules but lacked imagination or courage, but the damage was done. The secret was beginning to slip out of his control. That night, Ethan sat with Doc Merriweather and Sarah May. He'd brought her into his confidence because she deserved to know and because he trusted her judgment. The three of them talked long into the night about what came next. People will treat you differently, Sarah said quietly. Some will be genuine in their happiness for you. Others will resent you. Many will want something from you, and you'll never be quite sure which is which. I know. The trick, Doc added, is to stay grounded. Remember who you were before you found this gold. That man, the one who worked hard, who saved every penny, who treated people with respect, even when they mocked him. That's who you need to remain. Ethan looked at these two people who'd shown him kindness when he had nothing. I want to do something for both of you. Sarah, your store could use expansion, new inventory, maybe hire some help. Doc, your medical practice, you never turn anyone away, even when they can't pay. Let me establish a fund to cover treatments for those who can't afford them. Sarah shook her head. Ethan, you don't need to. I want to. You helped me when I was at my lowest. Let me do this. They talked until midnight, making plans, considering possibilities. For the first time since discovering the gold, Ethan felt the burden lightening. He wasn't alone in this. He had people he could trust, people who'd help him use this fortune wisely. But his peace was short-lived. 2 days after Christmas, Ty Granger appeared at the stable with Mayor Blackwell and 2 men Ethan didn't recognize. The banker's expression was triumphant. Mr. Wise, Blackwell said formally, we need to discuss your property and certain claims that have come to our attention. What claims? Ty stepped forward. These gentlemen are attorneys representing a mining concern in Nevada. They have documentation suggesting that the gold allegedly found on this property was illegally acquired by Baron Von Gault. They're filing a claim against the estate, and by extension, against you as the current property owner." Ethan felt cold fear settle in his gut. "I have documentation proving the gold was legally acquired." One of the attorneys, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, smiled without warmth. "We've examined those documents. They're incomplete. Several of the original mining claims were disputed in Nevada courts. Those disputes were never fully resolved before Wilhelm Gault fled the jurisdiction with the extracted gold. Our clients have a legitimate claim to a substantial portion of that wealth." "This is extortion," Ethan said flatly. "This is law," the attorney replied. "We're prepared to file suit in territorial court. The case could take years to resolve. During that time, the property and all assets on it would be frozen. You wouldn't be able to sell, use, or dispose of any of the gold." He paused, letting that sink in. "However, our clients are reasonable men. They're willing to settle for 50% of the gold's assessed value. In exchange, they'll drop all claims and provide you with clear title." Ethan looked at Ty Granger, seeing the satisfaction in the young banker's eyes. This had his fingerprints all over it. He'd somehow learned about the gold, probably through Morton, the assessor, and had contacted these Nevada attorneys, offering them a chance at a massive payday in exchange for whatever fee they'd agreed to pay him. "I need time to consider this," Ethan said. "You have 3 days," the attorney said. "After that, we file suit." After they left, Ethan stood in the empty stable, his hands clenched into fists. Everything he'd planned, every good he'd hoped to do, was threatened by greed and legal maneuvering. The Baron had been right to fear. Wealth attracted predators the way blood attracted sharks. But Ethan wasn't the Baron. He wasn't alone. And he wasn't going to hide in fear. This fortune was legally his, and he'd fight to keep it not for himself, but for all the good he could do with it. 3 days. He had 3 days to figure out how to protect his claim and save the future he'd been planning. 3 days to prove that he was wiser than poor Pennywise, the man the town had mocked. 3 days to show them all what he was really made of. Ethan spent that first night going through every document Pemberton had brought, searching for something he'd missed. The mining claims, the assay certificates, the transfer of ownership records, all of it painted a clear picture of legal acquisition. But the Nevada attorneys were right about one thing. There had been disputes, claims and counterclaims, legal challenges that Wilhelm Gault had apparently resolved before leaving Nevada. The question was, had he resolved them completely? At dawn, Ethan rode to the telegraph office and sent a message to Augustus Pemberton in Nevada. Then he gathered Doc Merriweather and Sarah May at his small house. "They're bluffing," Doc said after Ethan explained the situation. "It's a shakedown. They know you can't afford years of litigation, so they're betting you'll settle." "Maybe, but what if they're not bluffing? What if there really are unresolved claims?" Sarah, who'd been quiet, spoke up. "Then we find out the truth. We don't let them intimidate you into giving up half of something that's rightfully yours." The response from Pemberton came 2 days later. The old attorney had done his research, and his telegram was blunt. "Nevada claims fully resolved, 1,873. Court records available. Can provide certified copies. These men are frauds. Stand firm." Armed with this information, Ethan made a decision. Instead of waiting for the attorneys to file their suit, he would go on the offensive. He called a town meeting for the next evening, to be held in the community church. He sent word to Mayor Blackwell, to Ty Granger, and to the Nevada attorneys that he would be making an important announcement. The church was packed. News of Ethan's gold discovery had spread like wildfire through Dustridge, and everyone wanted to see what would happen next. People who'd mocked him 2 months ago now looked at him with a mix of envy and curiosity. Mayor Blackwell sat in the front row, his expression carefully neutral. Ty Granger stood near the back, arms crossed, confident in whatever scheme he'd set in motion. Ethan walked to the front of the church, carrying a folder of documents. His hands didn't shake. He'd spent his whole life being honest, and he'd be honest now. "Most of you know me as Pennywise," he began, "a poor cowboy who made a fool's purchase buying a worthless stable. Some of you are probably still laughing about it." He paused, meeting eyes around the room. "But that stable wasn't worthless. Baron Von Gault hid his fortune there, disguised as common equipment. I found it while doing repairs. Solid gold troughs, painted black, millions of dollars worth." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Ethan waited for the noise to die down. "I have documentation proving this gold was legally acquired through legitimate mining operations in Nevada. I have court records showing all disputes were resolved before the Baron left that state. The gold is mine by right of purchase and discovery." He looked directly at the Nevada attorneys. "These men have claimed the gold was illegally acquired. They're demanding 50% of its value, or they'll tie it up in court for years." One of the attorneys stood. "Mr. Wise is oversimplifying a complex legal situation. I'm stating facts," Ethan interrupted. "And here's another fact. I've been in contact with Baron Von Gault's attorney, who was present for all the Nevada proceedings. He's sending certified court documents proving these men's claims are fraudulent. They're running a con, betting I'll pay them off rather than fight." "That's slander," the attorney sputtered. "It's truth, and I have witnesses." Ethan gestured to the back of the room where Augustus Pemberton had just entered. Having travelled from Nevada in response to Ethan's urgent telegram, the old attorney walked slowly down the aisle, carrying a leather satchel. "Gentlemen," Pemberton said, addressing the Nevada attorneys, "I believe we've met before. You filed similar fraudulent claims against the Morrison Silver Strike in '88. The court didn't look kindly on it then, and I doubt the territorial court here will view it any better now." The two attorneys exchanged glances. Their con had been exposed in front of the entire town. They gathered their things and headed for the door, muttering about misunderstandings and incorrect information. Ty Granger, realizing his scheme had collapsed, tried to slip out with them. But Ethan's voice stopped him. "Mr. Granger, I believe you were instrumental in bringing these men to Dustridge. I wonder what fee they promised you for delivering a wealthy mark." Ty's face flushed red. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. And I think the bank's board of directors will be very interested to hear how their junior banker uses confidential property assessment information to facilitate fraud attempts." The young banker fled, and the room fell silent. Everyone had just witnessed Ethan Wise, poor Penny, stand up to lawyers and a banker and win. The man they'd mocked had proven himself stronger than any of them had imagined. After the lawyers left, Ethan remained at the front of the church, looking out at the faces of people who'd known him as nothing but a poor drifter. Now they saw him differently, and he could read the mixture of emotions in their eyes: wonder, envy, calculation, hope. "I know what some of you are thinking," he said quietly. "You're wondering what I'm going to do with all that wealth. Whether I'll leave Dustridge and live like a king somewhere else. Whether I'll forget where I came from." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "The truth is, I thought about it. When I first discovered what I had, I imagined all kinds of things. Revenge on those who'd mocked me. Buying the whole town and making everyone who'd laughed at me into my tenants." He saw a few people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Good, let them feel it. "But a wise man once told me that wealth doesn't make you who you are. It reveals who you've always been. And Baron Von Gault left me a letter warning me not to make his mistakes. He spent 20 years guarding his fortune, and it cost him everything that mattered. He died alone, wealthy and miserable." Ethan pulled out the Baron's charity list. Before he lost himself to fear, the Baron wanted to help people. He made this list of institutions he planned to support: hospitals, schools, orphanages. He never followed through because he was too afraid. "I'm going to honor his intentions. I've already contacted these organizations, and I'll be making substantial donations to each one. He could see the surprise in the crowd. This wasn't what they'd expected. But I also want to help here, in Dustridge. This community might have laughed at me, but it also had people who showed me kindness when I had nothing. Sarah May never turned me away from her store, even when I couldn't afford to buy much. Doc Merriweather treated me with dignity when others treated me like a joke. Mrs. Donovan trusted me to care for her beloved horse. Those acts mattered more than you know. Sarah May's eyes were bright with tears. Doc Merriweather nodded slowly, a small smile on his weathered face. "So here's what I'm going to do," Ethan continued. "I'm establishing a fund at the bank, not Ty Granger's bank, a different one to provide loans for people who want to start businesses or improve their properties. Low interest, reasonable terms. Real opportunities for folks who work hard but never quite get ahead." He saw heads nodding, people leaning forward with interest. "I'm going to fund the expansion of the school so we can hire another teacher and extend the building. Our children deserve better education than they're getting in that cramped one-room schoolhouse." More nods, and someone in the back called out, "Amen to that." "I'm going to establish a medical fund with Doc Merriweather so that no one in Dustridge has to choose between getting treatment and feeding their family. If you're sick or injured, you get care. No questions asked." Now people were smiling, the mood in the room shifting from curiosity to something warmer. "And I'm going to keep boarding horses at $5 a month, because that's honest work and I'm good at it. The stable will remain what it is, a place where ordinary people can get fair service at fair prices. Just because I have wealth doesn't mean I've forgotten what it's like to count every penny." Mayor Blackwell stood up. To his credit, he looked embarrassed. "Mr. Wise, I owe you an apology. I've treated you poorly, and I see now that I judged you unfairly. On behalf of the town, I want to thank you for your generosity." Ethan nodded acknowledgement, but didn't let the mayor off the hook completely. "I appreciate that, Mayor, and I hope you'll use your position to make sure these programs are administered fairly. No favorites, no corruption, just honest help for honest people." Blackwell flushed but nodded. "You have my word." As the meeting broke up, people came forward to shake Ethan's hand, to thank him, to tell him stories of their own struggles and hopes. He listened to each one, making mental notes of needs he could address, problems he could help solve. But the most meaningful moment came when Martha Donovan approached, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You didn't have to mention me," she said, "about trusting you with Rosie, but you did trust me. When no one else would, that mattered." She squeezed his hand. "You're a good man, Ethan Wise. Don't let anyone tell you different." Walking back to his stable that night, Ethan felt lighter than he had in months. The threat had been defeated, his claim was secure, and he'd taken the first steps toward using his fortune the way it should be used, to lift others up, not to build walls around himself. The stable looked the same as always, solid and massive against the night sky. Inside, 5 horses slept peacefully in their stalls. Below them, tons of gold sat hidden in plain sight, painted black and waiting. But Ethan Wise knew something the Baron never learned. The real treasure wasn't the gold. It was the connections you made, the lives you touched, the good you could do when you had the means and the will to help others. That was worth more than all the gold in Montana. 6 months later, spring had returned to Dustridge with all the promise of renewal and new growth. The snow had melted, wildflowers dotted the hillsides, and the town buzzed with activity that would have been unthinkable the previous year. Ethan stood in front of the stable, watching a construction crew put the finishing touches on the new schoolhouse annex. The building was sturdy and practical, with large windows to let in light and a proper heating stove for the Montana winters. Miss Elizabeth Carver, the new teacher he'd helped hire, was already preparing her classroom for the coming term, arranging books on shelves with obvious care. The stable itself had undergone changes too, though subtle ones. Ethan now boarded 15 horses regularly, and the business was genuinely profitable even without touching the gold. He'd hired young Tom Bidwell's son, Jack, to help with the work. The boy was 17, eager, and needed the income to help his family. It was honest employment, and Jack took pride in it. Doc Merriweather's medical fund had already helped 24 families. Old Frank Peterson had gotten treatment for his bad leg that he'd been putting off for 2 years. The Morrison twins had received medicine for their mother's cough before it could turn into something worse. People came to the doctor without fear of costs they couldn't bear, and the relief on their faces when Doc told them the fund would cover it never failed to move Ethan. Sarah May's store had expanded with new inventory and a hired assistant, a young widow named Beth, who needed the work. The store now carried goods that had previously been too expensive to stock, serving the community better than ever before. Sarah still insisted on giving Ethan special attention, though refusing payment for the food she regularly brought by. "You're paying me plenty through the work you've given me," she'd say, whenever he protested. "Let me do this small thing." The business loan fund had helped 7 families start new ventures or improve existing ones. Henry Walsh had expanded his farming operation. The Peterson brothers had opened a blacksmith shop that was already drawing customers from 3 counties. Each success story added to the growing sense that Dustridge was changing, becoming a place where hard work and honest ambition could actually lead somewhere. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people treated each other. The town that had once operated on mockery and social hierarchy had softened. When you knew that the man you'd laughed at could help you but chose to help everyone equally, it made you think twice about casual cruelty. When you saw someone wealthy living simply and working alongside regular folks, it challenged your assumptions about what mattered. Ty Granger had left town 2 months ago. The bank's board had quietly dismissed him after learning about his role in the attempted fraud. Ethan had felt no satisfaction in the young man's downfall, only a quiet sadness that greed had destroyed a promising career. Mayor Blackwell, to his credit, had become genuinely supportive of Ethan's charitable initiatives, perhaps learning that public service meant more than self-aggrandizement. Augustus Pemberton had stayed in Dustridge for a month before returning to Nevada. In that time, he and Ethan had become friends. The old attorney had helped Ethan set up proper legal structures for his various charitable funds, ensuring they'd continue long after Ethan was gone. Before leaving, Pemberton had shared one final piece of wisdom. "Wilhelm asked me once if I thought he'd made a mistake, acquiring so much wealth," the old man had said. "I told him that wealth itself isn't good or evil, it's just a tool. The measure of a man is what he builds with the tools he's given. You're building something good, Ethan." On this particular spring morning, Ethan had a special visitor. A young couple, newly married, had arrived from the next county over. They'd heard about the stable and wanted to see if Ethan might board their 2 horses while they established their homestead nearby. The young husband was nervous, clutching his hat, and clearly worried about costs. Ethan recognized himself in the young man's anxious expression, the fear of not having enough, of being unable to provide, of failing before you'd really begun. $5 a month per horse," Ethan said, "but for the first 3 months, while you're getting established, we'll call it $3 per horse. Sound fair?" The relief on both their faces was answer enough. As Ethan showed them the stalls and introduced them to the other horses, he thought about the Baron's letter. Use it wisely, share it generously. Do not let it cost you your humanity. He was trying. Every day, he was trying. That evening, sitting on the steps of his stable with Doc Merriweather and Sarah May, it had become a regular thing, the 3 of them sharing coffee and conversation as the sun set. Ethan reflected on how far he'd come. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Finding the gold? Your life was simpler before." Ethan considered the question seriously. His life was complicated now in ways he'd never imagined. He worried about managing the charitable funds properly, about making sure his help actually helped rather than creating dependence. He dealt with people who wanted favors, with the constant need to balance generosity against wisdom. Some nights he lay awake thinking about responsibilities that would have been unimaginable a year ago. "No," he said finally. I don't regret it. The gold gave me the means to make a difference. What I do with that, that's on me. And I'd rather have the chance to help and worry about doing it right than go back to having nothing to offer. Doc Merriweather raised his coffee cup. To Ethan Wise, the man who proved that finding your fortune and keeping your soul aren't mutually exclusive. They drank to that as the sun painted the Montana sky in shades of orange and gold. In the stable behind them, 15 horses settled in for the night. Below them, hidden beneath black paint, a treasure beyond measure sat untouched and undiminished, not because Ethan feared losing it, but because he'd learned what the Baron never did. Real wealth wasn't measured in gold. It was measured in the lives you touched, the good you did, the community you built. By that measure, Ethan Wise, once called Penny, once mocked as the poorest man in town, had become truly rich. And unlike the Baron, he wouldn't die alone. He had friends, purpose, and a future that stretched before him full of possibility. The man who'd bought a stable for nothing had gained everything that mattered, not despite his humility and honesty, but because of them. Some fortunes are found, others are earned. The best ones, Ethan had learned, are shared, and in the sharing they multiply beyond measure.